The wooden floorboards creaked beneath Miriam's worn boots as she moved about the sparse kitchen, her hands mechanically preparing the evening meal. Through the dusty window, she could see the last rays of sunlight painting the Wyoming sky in shades of amber and rust, the color of dried blood on weathered stone. The year was 1876, and the small frontier town of Redemption Creek had grown around the church like a tumor around a splinter. Her husband, Reverend Josiah Whitmore, sat in his study, the scratching of his pen against paper the only sound that competed with the desert wind rattling the shutters. Miriam knew without looking that he was crafting another sermon about the wages of sin, another diatribe about the weakness of the flesh and the damnation that awaited those who strayed from the narrow path. His words had once moved her to tears of devotion. Now they fell upon her ears like the monotonous drip of water torture. The town itself seemed carved from the very essence of judgment. Red dust coated everything, the buildings, the horses, the souls of its inhabitants. Women clutched their shawls tighter when they passed certain houses. Men spat tobacco juice and spoke of righteousness while their eyes lingered where they shouldn't. The church stood at the center of it all, its white-painted walls a lie against the crimson earth, proclaiming purity where none existed. Miriam's fingers trembled as she sliced the tough bread, remembering how Josiah's hands had gripped her shoulders that morning, his fingers pressing deep enough to leave marks hidden beneath her high-collared dress. "You must be above reproach," he had hissed, his breath hot against her ear. The wife of a man of God cannot give cause for gossip. Yet she had done nothing but smile too warmly at Mrs. Henderson when the widow had complimented her needlework. The storm had been building all day, both in the sky and in her husband's demeanor. She had learned to read the signs, the tightness around his mouth, the way his Bible thumped harder against the pulpit during his private rehearsals, the coldness that crept into his pale blue eyes like frost over a pond. Tonight would be bad. She could feel it in her bones the way some folks claimed they could feel rain coming, as if summoned by her thoughts. Josiah emerged from his study, his tall frame filling the doorway. At 43, he still cut an imposing figure, broad shoulders, silver threading through his dark beard, hands that could gesture toward heaven or clench into instruments of condemnation with equal facility. "Miriam," he said, and her name on his lips sounded like an accusation. "Brother Thompson came to me today with disturbing news." She kept her eyes on the pot of stew, stirring with careful precision. "Oh, you were seen speaking with that half-breed trader near the general store, laughing. He said—" The spoon stilled in her hand. She remembered the moment. Miguel Chavez had made a joke about his mule being more stubborn than a Baptist at a Catholic wedding. It had surprised a laugh from her, the first in weeks. "I was merely being polite. Josiah. He helped me when my basket—" The slap came without warning, sharp and precise. Snapping her head to the side, the spoon clattered to the floor. Miriam touched her cheek, feeling the heat bloom beneath her fingers. "Do not interrupt me when I speak," Josiah said, his voice never rising above its measured tone. That was the horror of it. He never shouted, never lost control. His cruelty was deliberate, calculated, wrapped in the vestments of righteousness. "You forget yourself. Wife, you forget your place." She bent to retrieve the spoon, using the moment to blink away the tears that threatened. Crying only made it worse. Crying was weakness, and weakness was sin. And sin required correction. "I have been too lenient," Josiah continued, pacing now, his boots heavy on the floor. "Too trusting, but no more. Tomorrow, you will stand before the congregation and confess your wayward nature. You will ask for their forgiveness and mine." Miriam's head snapped up. "Confess? But I've done nothing?" "Nothing." His voice dropped to a whisper, more terrifying than any shout. "You parade yourself through town like a common woman. You speak to men without proper supervision. You laugh." He spat the word like it was profane. "And worse, I know what thoughts lurk in your heart. I see how you look at the world beyond these walls, how you chafe against God's natural order." He moved closer, and she could smell the pomade in his hair, the tobacco on his breath despite his public condemnation of the vice. There are whispers, Miriam, whispers that the preacher cannot control his own wife, that perhaps she harbors unnatural desires. Such talk could ruin my ministry. That's not true, she whispered. But even as she said it, she wondered, was it unnatural to want to breathe freely, to speak without measuring each word against potential punishment, to dream of a place where laughter wasn't a sin? Truth is what I say it is. Josiah replied, and tomorrow you will speak the truth I give you. You will confess to harboring prideful thoughts, to failing in your wifely duties, to requiring my firm guidance to keep you on the path of righteousness. The congregation will see that I'm a man who keeps his house in order, and their faith in my leadership will be restored. The storm outside finally broke, rain lashing against the windows like 1,000 tiny fists. Lightning illuminated the room in stark flashes, revealing Josiah's face in moments of terrible clarity, the satisfaction in his eyes, the cruel set of his mouth, the absolute certainty of a man who had confused his own will with God's. And if I refuse? The words escaped before Miriam could stop them. Josiah's smile was thin as a blade. Then I will have no choice but to reveal the truth about your past, my dear, about the family you came from, about why you were so eager to marry a man of God when I found you in that Denver boarding house 5 years ago. Ice flooded her veins. He knew, somehow. He had always known about her father's drinking, about the debts, about the night she had fled with only the clothes on her back and her mother's silver locket, the one Josiah had sold last winter to buy new hymnals. She had thought marriage to a preacher would be salvation, a chance to start clean. Instead, she had traded one prison for another, and this one came with scripture readings. I thought so, Josiah said, reading her silence. Tomorrow, after the confession, we will put this unpleasantness behind us. You will be the model preacher's wife, silent, submissive, and grateful for my protection. Won't you, Miriam? She nodded, not trusting her voice. Good. I'll take my supper in the study. I have tomorrow's sermon to complete. He turned to go, then paused. And Miriam, pack away that blue dress. It's too becoming. A godly woman has no need for vanity. After he left, Miriam stood in the kitchen, listening to the storm rage outside. The thunder seemed to echo her heartbeat, wild and desperate. She thought of tomorrow, of standing before the congregation, Mrs. Henderson with her kind eyes, young Sarah Mills who looked at Miriam like she was everything a Christian woman should be, the men who would nod sagely as she debased herself for their satisfaction and Josiah's glory. Her hands moved without conscious thought, gathering items, the small stash of coins she had hidden beneath the loose floorboard, hard biscuits wrapped in cloth, the heavy wool shawl that had been her mother's. The storm would cover the sound of her leaving. The rain would wash away her tracks. By morning, when Josiah emerged expecting to find his submissive wife preparing breakfast, she would be miles away. Miriam paused at the door, looking back at the house that had been her cage for 5 years. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the cross on the wall, and she thought of all the prayers she had offered beneath it, all the time she had begged for strength, for patience, for the ability to be the wife Josiah demanded. Tonight, she finally had her answer. Sometimes, God's grace came not in the form of endurance, but in the courage to run. She stepped into the storm, gasping as the cold rain immediately soaked through her dress. The wind tore at her hair, pulling it free from its tight bun, and for a moment she stood there, face turned to the violent sky, feeling more alive than she had in years. Then she pulled the shawl over her head and started walking, leaving behind the town of Redemption Creek and the man who had turned scripture into shackles. The mountains loomed ahead, dark and forbidding, promising nothing but hardship and possibly death. But as Miriam pressed forward into the unknown wilderness, she thought that even death would be preferable to the slow suffocation of her soul. The storm howled around her, and she welcomed it, letting it sweep away the woman she had been, leaving only the wild, desperate creature she was becoming. Behind her, the lights of the town grew dim, then disappeared entirely, swallowed by the darkness and the rain. Ahead lay only wilderness, vast and unforgiving, where the rules of civilization meant nothing and a woman alone was prey to 1,000 dangers. But Miriam Walker, she had already shed the name Whitmore like a snake shedding its skin, pressed on, driven by a force stronger than fear, older than scripture, and more enduring than any marriage vow. Freedom, even if it lasted only hours, was worth any price. The cold had settled into Elias Macready's bones like an old friend, familiar and constant as the Winchester rifle across his lap. He sat motionless in the pre-dawn darkness, watching the frozen stream below his position, reading the forest's subtle language in the way the mist rose from the water. 20 years in these mountains had taught him patience, had carved away the soft parts of the man he'd once been until only the essential remained: sinew, instinct, and a heart that beat in time with the wilderness itself. The first light was just beginning to bleed through the pine canopy when he saw her. At first, Elias thought exhaustion was playing tricks on his eyes. It wouldn't be the first time the isolation had conjured phantoms. He'd seen his share of ghosts in these woods, shadows wearing the faces of the dead. But this was no specter. The woman stumbling along the stream bank was flesh and blood, though barely. Her dress, once respectable blue cotton, hung in tatters, heavy with ice. Her hair fell in dark, matted tangles around a face gone gray with cold. She moved like a broken marionette, each step a monumental effort against the failing machinery of her body. Elias remained still, assessing. In his experience, people this deep in the mountains meant trouble, either bringing it or running from it. The woman clearly fell into the latter category, but that didn't make her safe. Desperate people did desperate things, and he'd learned long ago that a cornered animal was the most dangerous kind. She collapsed 20 yards from his position, crumpling beside the stream like a discarded rag doll. Her body convulsed with shivers so violent he could see them from his perch. Still, Elias waited, watching for signs of pursuit, listening for sounds that didn't belong to the forest's morning symphony. Nothing. Whoever or whatever she was running from, she'd either lost them or they'd given up the chase. The woman tried to rise, failed, tried again. On the third attempt, she managed to drag herself to the stream's edge, breaking through the thin ice with her fist to cup water to her cracked lips. The effort seemed to exhaust her remaining reserves. She slumped forward, dangerously close to tumbling into the icy water. Elias sighed, the sound lost in the whisper of wind through pine needles. He couldn't leave her to die. The old Elias might have, the one who'd returned from the Indian Wars with more ghosts than memories, who'd retreated to these mountains to escape the weight of other people's lives on his conscience. But something in the woman's stubborn refusal to give up, even as her body failed her, stirred an echo of the man he'd been before the world had taught him the price of caring. He moved down the slope with the fluid grace of a man who'd learned to walk from wolves, his moccasins silent on the frost-brittle ground. The woman didn't react to his approach. Couldn't, most likely. Up close, he could see the purple shadows of frostbite creeping across her fingers, the bloody scratches where thorns and branches had torn at exposed skin. Her breathing was shallow, labored. Without intervention, she'd be dead within the hour. "Ma'am," he said quietly, not wanting to startle her into the stream. No response. He knelt beside her, noted the way she'd curled into herself, protecting her core heat with the instinct of a wounded animal. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes the color of storm clouds. For a moment, they held only confusion. Then fear crashed through like lightning. She tried to scramble away, a broken sound escaping her throat, but her body betrayed her. She managed only to press herself harder against the frozen ground. "Easy," Elias said, holding his hands where she could see them, palms out. "I mean no harm. You're about froze through. Let me help." Those gray eyes studied him with an intensity that suggested her mind, at least, remained sharp despite her body's deterioration. He saw her take in his appearance, the buckskin coat worn soft with years, the knife at his belt, the rifle he'd set aside. He knew what she saw, A man who'd forgotten the social niceties of civilization, whose dark hair hung past his shoulders in the Indian fashion, whose face bore the permanent squint of someone who'd spent more time reading trail sign than books. "Can you speak?" he asked. Her lips moved, but only a whisper emerged. "Please. Please what? Leave you to freeze? Can't do that. My conscience is heavy enough without adding your ghost to the collection." He shrugged out of his coat, ignoring the bite of cold air. "I'm going to wrap this around you, then carry you to shelter. You can fight me if you've a mind to, but I'd rather you save your strength for staying alive." She didn't fight. Couldn't. Really. When he wrapped the coat around her, the leather still warm from his body heat, she shuddered so hard he thought her bones might break. He lifted her easily. She weighed no more than a yearling deer, all sharp angles and desperate frailty. "My cabin's not far," he said, though he doubted she could hear him over the chattering of her teeth. "Got a fire, food, and no questions if you don't want them asked." The journey back took longer than usual, Elias picking his way carefully to avoid jarring his burden. She drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally murmuring words he couldn't catch. Once, clear as a church bell, she said, "Can't go back, rather die." The conviction in those 4 words told him more about her situation than any explanation could have. His cabin materialized from the forest like something grown rather than built. Logs weathered silver gray. Gaps chinked with mud and moss. A stone chimney already threading smoke into the morning air. He'd left the fire banked. A lifetime of caution had taught him never to return to a cold hearth. The door opened on leather hinges he'd oiled just days before. Silent as everything else about his existence here. Inside. The cabin was Spartan but clean. Everything in its place because disorder could mean death when winter storms trapped you for weeks. A single room with a stone fireplace. A bed built into one corner. Shelves holding supplies. Traps and tools hanging from pegs. The bearskin rug before the hearth had seen better days. But it was warm. And that was what mattered now. Elias laid the woman on the rug. Close enough to the fire for warmth, but not so close as to burn. Her shivers had taken on a different quality. Less violent, but somehow more concerning. He knew the signs of severe hypothermia. Had seen men slip from shivering to stillness to death with barely a whisper between stages. "Need to get you warm," he said, more to himself than to her. "Gradual-like, or your heart might give out from the shock." He worked with practiced efficiency, pulling off her frozen boots. The leather cracked. The laces snapped like brittle twigs. Her feet were white as bone. But when he pressed gently, the blood still flowed sluggish beneath the skin. Not frostbitten yet, just close. Her stockings came away in pieces, and he wrapped her feet in rabbit fur, soft and warm. The dress presented a problem. The fabric was frozen stiff. The buttons either torn away or iced shut. Modesty warred with necessity, and necessity won. He cut the dress away with his skinning knife, careful not to nick her skin, revealing undergarments that had once been white, but now showed the dirt and blood of hard travel. Bruises bloomed across her ribs like purple flowers, some fresh, others fading to yellow-green. Elias's jaw tightened. He'd seen enough violence to recognize its signatures. These weren't the marks of a fall or accident. These were deliberate, placed where clothing would hide them. His initial assessment shifted. She wasn't running from something, but someone. Someone who knew how to hurt without leaving visible evidence. He wrapped her in blankets, wool traded from the Shoshone. Wolf pelts he'd cured himself, layering warmth upon warmth. Then he set about making broth, shaving dried venison into water, adding wild onions and herbs his mother had taught him to recognize before the world went mad and took her away. The familiar actions calmed the anger building in his chest. Anger was a luxury he couldn't afford, not when there was work to be done. The woman stirred as the cabin warmed, her eyes opening to fix on the ceiling beams. Elias watched her awareness return in stages. Confusion, memory, fear, and finally, a wary acceptance of her current situation. "Drink this," he said, helping her sit up enough to sip the broth. "Slow, now. Your stomach won't thank you if you rush." She drank carefully, her hands shaking so badly he had to steady the cup. Color began returning to her cheeks, pink replacing gray. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice raw. "Got a name?" he asked. She hesitated, and he saw her make a decision. "Miriam, Miriam, just Miriam." "Fair enough. I'm Elias. This is my place. You're safe here." He paused, then added, "For now. Anyway, someone likely to come looking for you?" Her hands tightened on the cup. "My husband, maybe. I don't know how far I came. The storm. Husband." Elias kept his tone neutral, though the bruises told their own story. "He the reason you were wandering the mountains in a storm with no proper gear?" Miriam's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Reverend Josiah Whitmore doesn't approve of his wife having proper gear, or thoughts, or dignity." She looked up at him then, and he saw steel beneath the exhaustion. "I left. He wanted me to stand before the town and confess to sins I hadn't committed, to humiliate myself for his glory. I chose the storm instead." Elias nodded slowly. He'd known men like that, who wrapped their cruelty in righteousness, who used God as a cudgel. "Takes courage to run. Most don't." "Courage?" She shook her head. "Desperation. More like 5 years I endured, thinking it was my duty, my cross to bear. Then last night, something broke, or maybe it finally healed. I'm not sure which." She fell silent, sipping the broth. And Elias let the quiet stretch. He'd learned long ago that silence was often more healing than words, that sometimes people needed space to arrange their thoughts without the pressure of conversation. "Finally," she asked, "why did you help me? You don't know me." "I could be lying about everything." Elias considered the question, poking at the fire with a stick. Sparks rose up the chimney like ascending prayers. "Maybe you are. Doesn't much matter. I've seen enough death to last several lifetimes. Didn't feel like adding yours to the tally. You were a soldier?" "Once, during the war between the states. Then after, in the territories." His voice went flat, memories pressing against the barriers he'd built to contain them. "Did things in the name of duty that duty can't justify. Lost people who—" He stopped, shook his head. "Well, that's done now. These mountains don't care about what I was, only what I am. And what are you?" He looked at her then. Really looked, despite everything, the exhaustion, the fear, the physical toll of her flight. There was something unbroken in her gaze, a spark that reminded him of hawks he'd seen with damaged wings, fierce even in their vulnerability. "Just a man trying to live quiet," he said finally. "But seems the world has other plans." He stood, joints protesting the movement. "You should rest, real rest, not the half-frozen stupor you were in. Take the bed. I'll keep watch." "I couldn't." "You could and you will. Won't do either of us any good if you collapse again." He moved to the window, checking the sight lines out of habit. "Your husband, this reverend, he the type to organize a search party?" Miriam pulled the blankets tighter around herself. "Yes, his reputation is everything to him. A wife who runs away, who refuses to play her part in his performance of godliness. He'll come, or send others." "How many others?" "The church elders. Maybe, men from town who think he walks on water. They'll say they're saving me from myself, bringing the lost lamb back to the fold." Her voice turned bitter again. "Josiah's very good at making people believe his version of truth." Elias calculated distances, tracked the weather signs he'd noted that morning. Storm wiped out most of the tracks, but a good tracker might still find sign. "We'll need to move come morning, get you somewhere they won't think to look." "We?" She looked startled. "You don't have to. Maybe not, but I've taken you in, shared my fire, in my book. That makes you my responsibility until you're safe." He turned from the window to find her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Unless you'd rather face them alone?" "No," she said quickly. "No, I'm not used to kindness without conditions." "No conditions. Just sense. A woman alone in these mountains won't last long. Especially with winter coming on hard. A reverend's wife with no wilderness skills." He shook his head. "Might as well ring the dinner bell for the wolves." As if summoned by his words. A howl drifted through the night, distant but clear. Miriam shivered despite the warmth of the fire. "They won't hurt you," Elias said. "Wolves are careful creatures. It's men you need to worry about." She made a sound that might have been agreement or exhaustion. When he looked again, her eyes were closing, the cup sliding from her fingers. He caught it before it could spill, then adjusted the blankets around her shoulders. In sleep, the tension fled her face, leaving her looking younger, more vulnerable. Elias settled into his chair by the window, rifle across his knees, and prepared for a long night. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and steady, covering the last traces of Miriam's desperate flight. But it would take more than snow to discourage a man who thought he owned someone, and Elias had learned to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. In the fire's dying light, he studied the woman who'd stumbled into his carefully ordered solitude, Miriam, who'd chosen the killing cold over the slow death of her marriage, who'd run toward uncertainty rather than submit to certain humiliation. There was strength there, beneath the exhaustion and fear, the kind of strength that might survive what was coming, because something was coming. Elias could feel it in his bones, the way he'd once felt ambushes before they were sprung. The mountains had given him peace for 7 years, but peace was always temporary. Perhaps it was fitting that it would end with an act of kindness, with the choice to help rather than turn away. He thought of his sister Emma, dead these 15 years, and wondered if she would have run like Miriam had she lived to marry. The old pain stirred, but for once it brought clarity rather than anguish. He couldn't save Emma from the cholera that had taken her, couldn't save his parents from the raiders who'd followed, but he could save this woman, this stranger who'd collapsed by his stream like an offering from fate. The night deepened, and Elias kept watch. Guardian of a sanctuary that might not hold, protector of a woman whose very presence might shatter the solitude he'd thought he wanted. But as Miriam slept, safe for now in his rough cabin, he found he didn't regret the choice. Some things were worth the cost of their keeping. The smoke rose from Redemption Creek like incense from an altar, but this offering carried news of scandal rather than salvation. In the church vestry, Reverend Josiah Whitmore stood before his assembled elders, his face a masterwork of controlled anguish that had taken him hours to perfect before the mirror. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice breaking just enough to suggest deep emotion, "my wife has been taken by madness. The devil has poisoned her mind against her sacred duties." Elder Thompson, whose report about Miriam laughing with the traitor had started yesterday's confrontation, shifted his considerable weight. "When did you discover her absence, Reverend?" "This morning, when I rose for my dawn prayers. Her bed was cold. She had fled in the night storm like a thief." Josiah pressed a hand to his chest, over his heart. "I fear for her soul, brothers, and for her safety. A woman alone, in her disturbed state, prey to the wilderness and worse." The 6 men gathered in the vestry exchanged glances heavy with meaning. Elder Matthias Crawford, the town's most successful merchant, stroked his gray beard thoughtfully. "This is troubling indeed. A minister's wife abandoning her husband reflects poorly on the entire congregation, which is why we must bring her back." Josiah said quickly, "Not just for my sake, but for hers, for the community. We cannot allow the devil this victory." "What do you propose?" asked Elder Bennett, younger than the others but no less rigid in his beliefs. Josiah had spent the sleepless night preparing for this moment. "I ask for your help in organizing a search party. Men of faith who understand the delicate nature of this situation. We must find her before—" He let the sentence trail off, allowing their imaginations to fill in the horrors. "Before she speaks to outsiders," Crawford finished, his merchant's mind always attuned to reputation and its value. "Yes, I see. This must be handled carefully. I'll lead the search myself." Thompson volunteered, puffing out his chest. "Know these mountains well enough? My boy Samuel's the best tracker in 3 counties. God bless you, Brother Thompson." Josiah gripped the man's shoulder with practiced fervor. "But we must be prepared for resistance, The devil's hold on her is strong. She may not come willingly. Elder Mitchell, who had remained silent until now, cleared his throat. Reverend, forgive my asking, but had you noticed signs of this? Disturbance before. Sometimes women of a certain temperament. She concealed it well. Josiah interrupted smoothly. The devil is cunning. But yes, there were signs I foolishly ignored. Willfulness. Questions about scripture that bordered on heretical. An unhealthy attachment to worldly concerns. He lowered his voice conspirationally. I discovered she had been hoarding coins, planning this betrayal for some time. The elders' faces darkened with righteous anger. A wife who hoarded money from her husband was already suspect. One who used it to flee was beyond redemption without severe correction. We'll need supplies, Thompson said, already taking charge. Ropes, in case she's difficult. Food for several days. The storm will have covered her tracks. But she can't have gone far. A woman on foot. In that weather? He shook his head. If the cold didn't get her, she's holed up somewhere close. Check the old mining camps, suggested Bennett. Plenty of shelter there, if she knew where to look. She didn't, Josiah said with certainty. My wife had no knowledge of the wilderness. She rarely left town without me. A lie, but a necessary one. The fewer places they thought to look, the more time he had to find her first. Because Josiah had no intention of letting these men bring Miriam back alive. A dead wife, tragically lost to the mountains, was far better than a living one who might speak truth to the wrong ears. He had plans, ambitions that reached beyond this dusty frontier town, and a scandal could ruin everything. Better to play the grieving widower than the abandoned husband. We'll meet at dawn, Thompson declared. Bring any men you trust to keep their mouths shut. This is church business, not town gossip. The elders filed out, leaving Josiah alone in the vestry. He moved to the window, gazing out at the mountains that loomed beyond the town's borders. Somewhere in that wilderness, Miriam was either dead or wishing she was. The thought should have brought satisfaction, but instead, he felt only cold rage. How dare she defy him? How dare she choose death over submission? By afternoon, word had spread through Redemption Creek like wildfire. The minister's wife had run off in the night, stolen money, abandoned her sacred duties. In the general store, the saloon, the boarding house, tongues wagged and theories multiplied. Some said she'd taken up with a traveling man. Others whispered about madness, about the way she'd walked through town like a ghost these past months. A few of the women exchanged knowing looks, but kept their thoughts to themselves. Remembering bruises hastily explained, tears quickly suppressed. Meanwhile, miles into the mountain wilderness, Elias McCready crouched beside a stream, reading signs in the disturbed snow. 3 sets of boot prints, moving with purpose. They'd passed this way just hours ago, following the same water route Miriam had stumbled along. He'd expected this, had moved her from the cabin before dawn. But the speed of the pursuit surprised him. He returned to the sheltered grove where he'd left Miriam, finding her awake and alert despite the exhaustion etched in her features. She'd traded her ruined dress for clothing he'd provided. Men's trousers cut down to fit, a wool shirt, a coat that had belonged to a trapper who died 2 winters back and wouldn't be needing it anymore. The transformation was striking, freed from the constraints of proper feminine attire. She moved with an easier grace. They're coming, he said without preamble. 3 men, couple hours behind us. Good trackers, from the look of their pattern. Miriam's face paled, but her voice remained steady. My husband. Don't think so. These men know the mountains. He handed her a canteen, watched her drink. We need to move deeper, get to where horses can't follow, and then we make them earn every step. He shouldered his pack, checked his rifle. You up for hard travel? She stood, swaying slightly but finding her balance. I'm up for whatever keeps me from going back. They climbed throughout the day, Elias leading them through paths that barely deserved the name. The snow had resumed, heavy and steady. A blessing that would cover their tracks, but also a curse that made every step treacherous. Miriam struggled but didn't complain, even when they had to traverse a ledge so narrow that one wrong step would send them tumbling into the canyon below. "Here," Elias said during a brief rest, handing her strips of dried meat. "Eat. You're burning through strength you don't have to spare." She chewed mechanically, her eyes fixed on the trail behind them. Will they give up? Depends on what your husband promised them. Money, salvation. Men have chased less for both. "He's very persuasive," Miriam said bitterly. "He could make you believe water was wine if it served his purpose. The town thinks he's a prophet. They don't see what happens behind closed doors." Elias studied her profile, noted the way her jaw set with determination despite the fear he could smell coming off her like smoke. "Been my experience that prophets are just men who've gotten better at lying than most." A sound carried on the wind, a shout, distant but distinct. Miriam flinched, but Elias merely nodded. "They've found where we left the stream. Good. Means they're following the false trail I laid." "False trail?" "Doubled back this morning. Left sign heading toward the old Bannock trading post. Should buy us time." He stood, offered her a hand up. "But not much. We need to reach the ice caves before nightfall." The terrain grew more brutal as they climbed. The snow turned to sleet, coating everything in a skin of ice that made footing treacherous. Miriam fell twice, the second time sliding 10 feet before Elias caught her arm, nearly dislocating it in the process. She bit back a cry of pain, and he saw tears freeze on her cheeks before she could wipe them away. Not much farther. He lied. It was another mile at least, and the hardest ground yet. Thunder rumbled overhead, unusual for a winter storm. The temperature was dropping fast. Elias could feel it in the way his breath crystallized, in the complaints of his old injuries. If they didn't reach shelter soon, the cold would do the search party's work for them. "Tell me something," Miriam said suddenly, her words punctuated by labored breathing. "Why did you really stay in these mountains? A man with your skills could make a life anywhere." Elias was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief. "Had a family once. Parents, sister. Little farm in Missouri. Nothing special except it was ours. I was 17 when I joined up. Thought I was saving the Union." He helped her over a fallen log, his hand steady despite the tremor in his voice. "Came home on leave to find them dead. Raiders. Could have been either side by then. Didn't much matter. Emma was 12. Well, some things don't bear repeating." Miriam touched his arm gently. "I'm sorry. Long time ago. But after the war, after what I did in the territories, civilization didn't feel like somewhere I belonged anymore. These mountains don't judge. They'll kill you clean if you're careless. But they don't pretend to be righteous about it." They reached the ice caves as the last light faded from the sky. The entrance was barely visible, a crack in the rock face that widened into a series of connected chambers carved by water and time. Elias had stockpiled supplies here, planning for emergencies. He'd never imagined the emergency would involve a runaway preacher's wife. Inside, the temperature was warmer than outside, though still cold enough to see their breath. Elias lit a small fire near the entrance, the smoke drawing up through natural vents. The light danced on walls of ice and stone, creating a cathedral of shadows. "It's beautiful," Miriam breathed, looking around with wonder and defensive. Elias added pragmatically, "One way in, good sight lines. Echo carries sound. We'll hear them coming," as if to prove his point. A sound did carry, the distant bark of dogs. Miriam went rigid. "They brought hounds," she whispered. "Josiah knows I'm terrified of dogs. His father used to—" She stopped, shook her head. "It doesn't matter now. Dogs can't track over ice," Elias assured her. "And this storm's washing out scent trails. They're guessing now, casting wide." He pulled out blankets, food, ammunition. "We'll wait them out. Men from town won't last long in this weather. They'll turn back by morning." But even as he spoke, Elias wondered. The pursuit had been faster and more organized than expected. Either this Reverend Whitmore had more influence than Miriam knew, Or there was more at stake than a runaway wife. He'd learned to trust his instincts, and right now they were screaming that the real danger hadn't shown itself yet. Miriam huddled close to the fire, exhaustion finally overwhelming fear. "I keep thinking I'll wake up back in that house," she admitted. "That this is all some fever dream brought on by wishful thinking." "It's real," Alea said quietly. "The cold, the fear, the running, all real. But so is getting through it. You're tougher than you know." She looked at him then, firelight catching the gold flecks in her gray eyes. "You don't know me. I might be weak. I might break when they catch up." "Might," he agreed. "But I don't think so. Weak people don't run into blizzards. They don't climb mountains in ice storms. They don't keep going when their bodies are screaming to quit." He met her gaze steadily. "Whatever else you are, Miriam, you're not weak." Outside, the storm raged on, sealing them in their ice sanctuary. The search party was out there somewhere, probably huddled in whatever shelter they could find, cursing the weather and the woman who'd led them into it. But for now, in this moment, Miriam was safe. She pulled the blankets tighter around herself, watching Elias as he methodically cleaned his rifle. There was something calming about his movements, the careful attention to each part, the quiet competence of a man who'd learned that survival often came down to preparation and maintenance. "What happens tomorrow?" she asked. "Tomorrow we keep moving, higher, deeper, until they give up or we find a place they can't follow." He looked up from his work. "Unless you've changed your mind, it's not too late to go back. Face whatever. I'd rather die," she said flatly, and he heard the truth of it in her voice. "Then we keep going," he said simply, "until we can't anymore." The fire crackled between them, pushing back the dark. Outside, wolves howled, and the storm continued its assault on the mountains. But inside the ice cave, for the first time in years, neither Elias nor Miriam felt entirely alone. The fire had burned low, casting dancing shadows on the ice cave walls as Miriam finally found the courage to speak the words that had been clawing at her throat for hours. Elias sat across from her, patient as the mountains themselves, his dark eyes reflecting the dying flames. "You asked why I ran," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't just the confession he wanted me to make, it was what came after." She pulled the blanket tighter, as if it could shield her from the memories. "Josiah had plans, a traveling ministry. He called it taking his wife from town to town, displaying her as a reformed sinner, a testament to his power to save even the most wayward soul." Elias remained silent, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "He'd already written my testimony," Miriam continued, bitter laughter escaping her lips. "How I'd harbored lustful thoughts, how I'd been tempted by worldly desires, how only his firm guidance kept me from falling into complete depravity. I was to be his prop, his proof of godliness, a broken woman he'd generously saved." "But you weren't broken," Elias observed quietly. "No, bent, maybe cracked in places, but not broken." She met his gaze directly. "That made me dangerous. A broken woman would have stood before that congregation and spoken his lies, would have traveled with him, testified to his glory, helped him climb whatever ladder he thought God was holding steady for him." She stood abruptly, pacing the small space, unable to contain the energy of her revelations. "Do you know what the worst part was? For years, I believed him. When he said my thoughts were sinful, when he told me my desires were unnatural, when he convinced me that wanting to laugh, to speak freely, to exist as more than his shadow was evidence of my corrupt nature, I believed every word." "What changed?" Elias asked. Though he suspected he knew, he'd seen it in soldiers. That moment when the soul finally rebels against what the mind has been forced to accept. Miriam paused by the cave entrance, staring out at the swirling snow. "There was a woman who came through town last spring, a widow, traveling alone, selling herbs and remedies. The town gossips called her scandalous, but I saw something else. Freedom, joy. She laughed without checking first to see who was watching. She spoke her mind without measuring each word against someone else's approval. She turned back to face him. That night, Josiah forbade me from speaking to her again, said she was a bad influence, would corrupt my virtue. And I realized, what virtue? What was left to corrupt? He'd already taken everything that made me myself. The wind howled outside, but in the cave, her words created their own storm. Elias felt them stirring things he'd buried deep, memories of his sister Emma and her wild laughter. The way she'd run through the fields with her hair streaming behind her like a banner of rebellion against all the rules that said young ladies should be sedate and proper. "So you ran," he said simply. "So I ran." Miriam returned to the fire, sinking down across from him. "And now I'm here, in a cave of ice with a man I barely know, hunted like an animal. And you know what?" A smile broke across her face, transformative in its genuineness. "I feel more alive than I have in 5 years." Elias found himself responding to that smile despite years of practiced stoicism. Danger has a way of clarifying things. It's not just the danger. She leaned forward, her eyes bright with something that might have been fever or might have been awakening. "It's the choice. Every step I've taken since leaving that house has been mine. Every hardship, every fear, every moment of pain, all mine. Not inflicted by someone else's vision of who I should be, but chosen by me." Choice is a powerful thing, Elias agreed, remembering his own decision to walk away from civilization, to let the mountains remake him into something that could bear the weight of his memories. "Tell me about her," Miriam said suddenly. "Your sister, Emma." Elias stiffened, the request catching him off guard. He rarely spoke of Emma, had trained himself to keep those memories locked away where they couldn't ambush him. But something in Miriam's eyes, understanding, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit, loosened his tongue. "She was 12 when she died," he began slowly, "but old for her years in some ways. Knew her own mind. That one used to drive our mother to distraction, always asking why things had to be just so. Why couldn't she wear trousers to milk the cows? Why did she have to sit silent when the men talked politics? Why did God make rules that seemed designed to squeeze all the joy out of His creation?" Miriam smiled softly. "She sounds wonderful." She was wild as a Mustang and twice as stubborn. Used to sneak out at night to lie in the fields and watch the stars. Said they made more sense than people. His voice roughened. "I was supposed to protect her. That's what big brothers do, but I was off playing soldier. And when the raiders came, it wasn't your fault," Miriam said firmly. "No, I chose to leave. Chose glory and adventure over staying home where I was needed." He picked up a piece of wood, turning it over in his hands. "Came back to find the house burned, the fields destroyed. Found Emma in the barn. They'd hurt her before they killed her. Found my parents in the well. The raiders had made sport of it all." Miriam moved without conscious thought, placing her hand over his. The touch burned through him like lightning. The first human contact he'd allowed in years that wasn't purely functional. "After that," he continued, his voice steadier with her touch grounding him, "I hunted, tracked down every man who'd been part of that raiding party. Took me 2 years, but I found them all. What I did to them." He shook his head. "Let's just say I understand why your husband preaches about hell. I've been there. I created it for those men. They deserved it," Miriam said fiercely. "Maybe, but it didn't bring anyone back. Didn't fill the hole they'd left. Just made me into something Emma wouldn't have recognized." He finally looked up, meeting her eyes. "That's why I came here. Not to hide from the law. What I did was never called murder. Not in those days. I came to stop being the thing I'd become." "And did you stop being that thing?" Elias considered the question. "Thought I had 7 years of silence, of snow and stone and solitude. Thought I'd carved away everything but the essential." He squeezed her hand gently before releasing it. "Then you stumbled out of a storm. And here I am, ready to do violence again if those men threaten you." Maybe we never really change. Maybe we just learn to live with who we are. Miriam was quiet for a long moment, processing his words. Then she spoke, her voice carrying a certainty that surprised them both. I think you're wrong. I think we change every day, with every choice we make. The man who saved me from freezing isn't the same one who hunted those raiders. He couldn't be. That man wouldn't have seen me by the stream and chosen mercy. You don't know what I'm capable of, Elias warned. No, she agreed. But I know what you've chosen so far. That matters more than what you might do, doesn't it? Before he could answer, a sound cut through the storm. The baying of hounds, closer than before. Both of them tensed. The moment of intimacy shattered by renewed danger. They're pushing through the storm, Elias said, moving to the cave entrance. Desperate or stupid, maybe both. What do we do? He was already gathering supplies. His movements efficient and purposeful. We don't wait for them to corner us. These caves connect to a series of tunnels, dangerous in the dark, but less dangerous than armed men with dogs. They plunged deeper into the mountain, Elias leading with a torch that threw wild shadows on the walls. The passages twisted and turned, sometimes opening into chambers of breathtaking beauty, where ice formations caught the light like frozen waterfalls, sometimes narrowing until they had to crawl on hands and knees. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit echoed strangely, sometimes seeming close enough to touch, sometimes fading to nothing. The dogs were having trouble with the scent, confused by the minerals in the stone and the water that seeped from every surface. Here, Elias said finally, pulling Miriam into a side chamber barely large enough for both of them. Stay quiet. Sound travels strange in these tunnels. They pressed together in the darkness, sharing breath and warmth. Miriam could feel Elias's heart beating, steady and strong, could smell leather and wood smoke and something uniquely him. She thought of Josiah, of the way his presence had made spaces feel smaller, tighter, airless. Elias made even this tiny chamber feel like freedom. Voices drifted through the passages, distorted but recognizable. Can't have gone far. Wounded, maybe. Reverend said bring her back no matter what. Dead or alive, he said. Long as we can prove we found her. Miriam's breath caught. Elias's arm tightened around her. A silent message. Stay calm, stay quiet. The searchers passed by their hiding spot, their torches sending brief flickers of light through cracks in the stone. One man stopped so close they could hear his labored breathing. Something ain't right, the man muttered. Preacher's wife runs off, and we're hunting her like she murdered someone? What kind of woman needs bringing back dead or alive? Kind that shames her husband. Another voice answered. You questioning the Reverend? Samuel. No, sir, Mr. Thompson. Just saying it sits uneasy, is all. Lots of things sit uneasy in this life. Boy, that's why we got men like Reverend Whitmore to show us the right path. Now keep moving. She's here somewhere. The voices faded, but Elias and Miriam remained frozen for long minutes after. Finally, when the only sound was dripping water and their own breathing, Elias spoke. Dead or alive, he repeated grimly. Your husband's showing his true face now. He wants me dead, Miriam said, the reality of it hitting her fully. I'm more useful to him as a martyred wife than a rebellious one. Then we make sure you stay inconveniently alive. Elias said, Can you keep going? There's another exit, but it's a hard climb. I can do whatever needs doing, she replied, and meant it. They emerged from the caves as dawn was breaking, storm clouds giving way to a sky painted in shades of pearl and rose. The world spread out below them, vast and wild and full of possibility. But Miriam found herself looking not at the view, but at the man beside her, this unlikely savior who carried his own ghosts but still had room for her salvation. Elias, she said softly. He turned to her, a question in his eyes. Thank you. Not just for saving me, but for seeing me. The real me. Not the role I've been forced to play. Something shifted in his expression, walls crumbling just a little. Miriam? She stepped closer, close enough to see the gold flecks in his brown eyes, close enough to count the lines that pain and weather had carved into his face. That night, when Josiah gave his ultimatum, I thought I had two choices: submit or die. I chose what I thought was death. She reached up, her fingers barely brushing his cheek. I didn't know I was choosing life. The kiss was inevitable as sunrise and soft as new snow, fierce as the storm they'd weathered. It tasted of possibility and danger, of choices made and paths taken. When they parted, both breathing hard, Elias saw his own wonder reflected in her eyes. "This complicates things," he said roughly. "Everything about my life is complicated," Miriam replied. "This is the first complication I've chosen for myself." Below them, somewhere in the maze of stone and ice, angry men searched for a woman who no longer existed. The obedient wife, the submissive creature who measured her worth by her husband's approval. She had died in that storm. What emerged was someone new, someone who could meet a damaged man's gaze without flinching, who could choose desire over duty without shame. "They won't stop," Elias warned. "Your husband has made this about more than a runaway wife now. It's about his authority, his image." "Then we keep running," Miriam said simply. "Or we stop and fight. Either way, we choose together." Elias looked at her, really looked, the way he'd trained himself not to look at anyone for 7 years. He saw strength forged in the fire of oppression, beauty that had nothing to do with conventional prettiness and everything to do with the light that burned behind her eyes. He saw a survivor, a fighter, a woman who'd walked through her own hell and emerged not unscathed but unbroken. Together, he agreed, and took her hand. They descended the far side of the mountain as the sun climbed higher. Two souls who'd found each other in the wilderness, bound now by more than circumstance. Behind them lay the wreckage of their old lives. Ahead stretched unknown territory, dangerous and uncertain, but for the first time in longer than either could remember. That uncertainty felt like promise rather than threat. The preacher's wife had run from sin, only to discover that what she'd been taught was sinful. Desire, independence, the fierce joy of being truly alive might be the most sacred things of all. And if that was damnation, both she and the rugged scout who'd taught her its pleasures would choose it gladly, again and again, for all the days they had left. The canyon narrowed ahead, walls of red stone rising like prison bars against the gray sky. They'd been moving for 2 days since leaving the ice caves, staying to the high country where horses couldn't follow, but their pursuers had proven more persistent than expected. Now, with supplies running low and exhaustion weighing heavy on their limbs, Elias and Miriam found themselves forced into a natural funnel that offered no easy escape. "There!" Elias pointed to a ledge halfway up the canyon wall. "We can defend that position if we need to." Miriam nodded, though the climb looked impossible to her weary body. Her hands were raw from scrambling over rocks. Her feet blistered inside boots never meant for such harsh travel. But she'd learned something in these days of flight. The body could endure far more than the mind believed possible. They made the ledge just as the first riders appeared at the canyon mouth. 5 men, Thompson at their head, his bulk somehow graceful in the saddle. No dogs this time. The terrain had become too treacherous even for hounds. "Mrs. Whitmore," Thompson's voice boomed off the canyon walls. "Your husband sent us to bring you home. No harm will come to you if you surrender now." Elias had positioned himself behind a boulder, rifle ready. "That's close enough," he called down. "The lady doesn't wish to return. This ain't your concern, stranger." Thompson replied, "This is between a man and his wife. Christian business." "Funny thing about Christian business," Elias said. "Seems to involve a lot of hunting women through the mountains like animals." One of the younger riders shifted nervously. It was Samuel, Thompson's son, and even from this distance, Miriam could see doubt written on his face. "Ma'am," Samuel called up, his voice cracking slightly. "Your husband's worried sick, says you're not in your right mind. Just come back peaceful-like, and everything will be forgiven." Miriam stepped forward, surprising Elias. "Forgiven?" Her voice carried clear and strong. "What needs forgiving, Samuel? That I refuse to lie before God and the congregation, That I wouldn't bear false witness against myself. The men below exchanged glances. This wasn't what they'd expected. Not the raving madwoman Josiah had described, but a clear-eyed woman stating her case. Reverend says you stole from him. Thompson accused. Says you took money meant for the church. I took what I'd saved from selling eggs and mending clothes. Miriam replied. Money I earned with my own hands. If that's theft, then every woman who keeps a penny from her household sales is a thief. Don't listen to her, another rider interjected. Matthews, who ran the livery stable. The Reverend warned us she'd try to twist things, said the devil's given her a silver tongue. Has he now? Miriam laughed, but there was no humor in it. And what else did my husband tell you? Did he mention the bruises, the nights I spent locked in the root cellar for the sin of speaking my mind? Did he tell you about the confession he wrote for me to recite, full of sins I never committed? Lies. Thompson growled, but Samuel was frowning now. Pa, the young man said quietly. Maybe we should. Quiet, boy. We've got our orders. Thompson raised his voice again. You've got 1 minute to climb down. Mrs. Whitmore. After that, we're coming up. Elias levered around into his rifle. The sound sharp in the canyon's acoustics. First man who tries it gets buried here. You'd shoot Christians doing their duty? Matthews demanded. I'd shoot any man who threatens a woman under my protection, Elias replied evenly. Christian or heathen makes no difference to lead. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Miriam could feel the violence building like storm pressure, could see it in the way hands drifted toward weapons, in the tension that radiated from Elias beside her. In moments, blood would spill, and it would be her fault. More violence born from her choice to flee. Wait, she called out, decision crystallizing. I'll come down. Miriam, no, Elias said sharply. She turned to him, touching his arm gently. Trust me, she whispered, then louder. I'll come down, but I have conditions. I want witnesses, neutral parties who'll hear what I have to say. Thompson snorted. You're in no position to make demands. Woman. Aren't I? Miriam stepped closer to the edge, letting them see her clearly. You can try to take me by force. Some of you will die. Mr. McCready is an excellent shot, and this position gives him every advantage. Or you can agree to my terms, and this ends without bloodshed. What terms? Samuel asked, earning a glare from his father. We go to Silver Creek, Miriam said, naming a larger town 2 days' ride away. The circuit judge is there this week. I'll make my case before him, and let the law decide whether a woman can be hunted down for leaving a marriage that threatened her life and soul. The law's got nothing to do with this, Thompson protested. It's church business. Is it? Miriam's voice hardened. Then why did my husband tell you to bring me back dead or alive? Since when does church business include murder? The words hung heavy in the air. Samuel's face had gone pale, and even Matthews looked uncomfortable. He never said that, Thompson insisted, but his denial lacked conviction. He did, Pa. Samuel said quietly. You know he did. Said it would be better if she had an accident than came back spreading lies. Shut your mouth, boy! But the damage was done. The other riders were muttering among themselves, the unified front cracking. I ain't killing no woman for leaving her husband, one said. Didn't sign up for that. Nobody's killing anybody. Thompson snarled, but his authority was slipping. Elias watched the dynamics shift with a tactician's eye. Seems your men have more conscience than your preacher counted on, he observed. 1 hour. Miriam pressed her advantage. Give us 1 hour to come down on our own terms. We'll ride to Silver Creek, all of us together. Let justice be done in daylight, not in blood. The silence stretched until Samuel broke it. I think we should agree. Pa, if she's truly mad like the Reverend says, the judge will see it. And if not, he trailed off, but the implication was clear. Thompson's face was dark with rage, but he was outnumbered now. His own son turned against him. 1 hour, he spat. Then we're coming up, terms or no terms. The riders retreated to the canyon mouth, setting up camp where they could watch the only exit. Elias immediately began planning alternative routes, But Miriam stopped him. I meant what I said. We're going to Silver Creek. That's fool talk. You think a judge in these parts will side with a woman against a preacher? Maybe not, Miriam admitted. But running forever isn't living, and I won't have your blood on my conscience, or theirs. She gestured toward the camp below. Samuel's just a boy, confused and trying to do right. The others are men with families. They don't deserve to die because my husband is a monster. Elias studied her face, seeing determination that wouldn't be swayed. You're gambling everything on the hope that truth matters more than power. I'm gambling on the hope that some people still recognize truth when they hear it. She met his gaze steadily. And if I'm wrong, at least I'll have stood up and spoken it. That's more than I've done in 5 years. They used the hour to prepare, but not for escape. Miriam cleaned herself as best she could with snow and a scrap of cloth, braiding her hair neatly. She wanted to look respectable, not wild. Elias watched her transformation with growing unease. You're walking back into a cage, he said. Maybe. Or maybe I'm walking into a courtroom where cages get opened. She turned to him, and he saw fear beneath the determination, but also something else, hope. Will you stand with me? You know I will. Even if it means facing your own past. They'll ask who you are, why you're involved. Elias considered this. 7 years of solitude had been his penance, his escape. But looking at Miriam, at the courage she wore like armor despite the terror he could see in the tremor of her hands, he realized some things were worth coming out of hiding for. Let them ask, he said. They descended together as the sun reached its zenith, Miriam's hand steady in his as they navigated the treacherous path. The riders waited, tension thick as morning fog. Thompson's hand rested on his pistol, but Samuel had positioned himself between his father and the approaching pair. We're ready, Miriam announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd made peace with whatever came next. You'll ride with me, Thompson commanded, but Miriam shook her head. I'll ride my own horse, or I'll walk. I'm not your prisoner, Mr. Thompson. I'm a woman seeking justice. It was Matthews who finally offered his spare mount, a gentle mare that Miriam mounted with more grace than her exhausted body should have allowed. Elias swung up onto his own horse, rifle still within easy reach. No trouble from you, Thompson warned him. No trouble as long as the lady's treated with respect, Elias replied. They rode out of the canyon as the afternoon sun slanted low. An unlikely procession, the runaway wife, the mountain hermit, and the posse that had become something more complicated than hunters. Samuel rode close to Miriam, sneaking glances at her when he thought no one was looking. Ma'am, he said finally, voice low, is it true? What you said about the Reverend? Miriam considered her words carefully. What do you think, Samuel? You've sat in his church. You've heard his sermons about mercy and justice. Does hunting a woman through the mountains sound like either? The young man was quiet for a long moment. My ma used to say that sometimes the devil quotes scripture better than saints. Your mother sounds wise. She was... Pain flickered across his features. Died 3 winters back. The Reverend spoke at her funeral, said she was lucky to be released from the trials of womanhood. He glanced at Miriam again. Never did sit right, him saying that while we were grieving. They made camp that night in a sheltered grove, the men maintaining an uneasy truce. Elias never strayed far from Miriam's side, his presence a silent warning to anyone who might forget she was under his protection. But the dynamic had shifted. What had begun as a hunt had become something more like an escort, with even Thompson seeming uncertain of his role. Around the campfire, stories emerged. Matthews spoke of his wife, how she'd grown quiet these past years, jumping at shadows. Another man mentioned his daughter, hastily married off after some unnamed scandal involving the church. They didn't say it outright, but Miriam heard the doubts threading through their words, the questions they'd been afraid to ask. He's a man of God, Thompson insisted when the stories grew too pointed. Sometimes the righteous path seems harsh to those who don't understand. Pa, Samuel said quietly. Remember what Ma used to say? That God's love shouldn't feel like a fist? Thompson had no answer to that. On the second night, with Silver Creek just hours away, Miriam sat beside Elias watching the stars wheel overhead. Tomorrow would bring judgment, one way or another. Scared? Elias asked. Terrified, she admitted. But also, she searched for words. Free. Whatever happens tomorrow, I chose it. That matters. He took her hand, rough fingers gentle against her skin. For what it's worth, I think you're the bravest woman I've ever known. Brave or foolish? Sometimes they're the same thing. He was quiet for a moment. Miriam, if this goes bad, it won't. But if it does, she silenced him with a kiss. Soft but fierce. Then we face that together too. But tonight, I need to believe that truth can win, that speaking it out loud, in front of witnesses, can break the power of lies. Let me believe that, just for tonight. He pulled her close, and they sat in silence, watching the fire die to embers. Around them, the camp slept uneasily, men wrestling with conscience and duty. Tomorrow would bring revelation or ruin, justice or persecution. But tonight, under the vast Wyoming sky, a woman who'd run from sin sat wrapped in the arms of the man who'd taught her that what she'd been running from wasn't sin at all, but the twisted perversion of it. That love could be gentle, that desire could be sacred, that choosing her own path was not rebellion against God, but perhaps the truest form of worship, honoring the free will that was humanity's greatest gift. The stars burned on, ancient and indifferent, but beneath them, two souls had found each other in the wilderness. Whatever tomorrow brought, that would remain true. It was, Miriam thought, more than enough reason to hope. The attack came at dawn, shattering the fragile peace like glass against stone. Elias woke to the whistle of an arrow passing inches from his head, his instincts pulling him into motion before his mind fully registered the danger. Ambush, he roared, rolling toward his rifle as more arrows thudded into trees and bedrolls. It wasn't Indians. The war cries were wrong. The tactics too clumsy. These were white men playing at savagery, using the cover of an Indian attack to mask their true purpose. Elias recognized the deception immediately, even as he returned fire at the shadows moving between the trees. Circle up, Thompson bellowed, all uncertainty forgotten in the face of combat. The men scrambled for cover, their differences suddenly meaningless against a common threat. Miriam had rolled behind a fallen log, Elias's lessons in survival serving her well. She kept low, making herself small, but her eyes were alert, scanning for threats. When a figure burst from the underbrush heading straight for her, she didn't hesitate. She brought up the pistol Elias had given her and fired. The man stumbled, clutching his shoulder, and in that moment she recognized him. Jacob Mills, one of Josiah's most devoted followers from Redemption Creek. The truth hit her like cold water. This was no random attack. Josiah had sent his own hunting party, men who wouldn't question orders, wouldn't develop inconvenient consciences. They're after me, she shouted to Elias. It's Josiah's men. The battle intensified, gunfire echoing off the mountains like thunder. Samuel fought beside his father, their earlier conflict forgotten in the need to survive. Matthews took a bullet in the leg but kept firing, propped against a boulder. The attackers had expected easy prey, a woman and a few conflicted townsmen. They hadn't counted on Elias McCready. He moved through the battlefield like death itself, every shot finding its mark, using the terrain and shadows with an expertise that spoke of years of practice. The war had taught him to kill efficiently, and the years of hunting had only sharpened those skills. But it was the need to protect Miriam that gave him purpose beyond mere survival. A man tried to flank their position, creeping through the underbrush with a knife glinting in his hand. Elias met him halfway, and they grappled in deadly silence. The attacker was younger, stronger perhaps, but Elias fought with the desperate fury of a man with something to lose. The knife ended up in its owner's chest, and Elias moved on without pause. Through the chaos, he kept track of Miriam, watched her hold her position with courage that made his chest tight with an emotion he couldn't afford to examine in the middle of a fight. When 3 men made a coordinated rush toward her position, he was already moving. The first man fell to Elias's rifle. The second took a bullet from Samuel Thompson, the boy proving himself in fire. The third reached Miriam just as her pistol clicked empty. Time slowed as Elias watched the man raise his rifle, saw Miriam's eyes widen with the knowledge that this was the end. The distance was too great, his own rifle empty. No time to reload, so he did the only thing left. He threw himself between them. The bullet took him high in the chest, spinning him around. He heard Miriam scream his name, saw her snatch up a rock and bring it down on the attacker's skull with savage force. Then he was falling, the sky wheeling overhead, pain blooming like a red flower across his vision. No, no, no! Miriam was there, her hands pressed against the wound, tears streaming down her face. Stay with me. You stay with me. Elias Macready. Around them, the battle was turning. The attackers had lost too many men. Their careful plan dissolved into chaos. Thompson and his men pressed their advantage, driving the remnants back into the forest. In minutes, it was over, leaving only the groans of the wounded and the copper smell of blood. Need to stop the bleeding. Samuel appeared at Miriam's side, his young face grave. My ma taught me some healing before she passed. Together they worked over Elias, Miriam following Samuel's instructions with hands that shook but didn't falter. The bullet had missed his heart, but not by much, lodging somewhere beneath his shoulder blade. Each breath brought pink foam to his lips. Lungs nicked, Samuel said quietly. He needs a real doctor. Or, then we get him to one. Miriam said fiercely. How far to Silver Creek? 3 hours hard riding, but moving him could. Staying here will kill him for certain. She looked up at Thompson, who had approached during the exchange. Will you help us? The big man studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. We'll rig a travoy. Matthews needs tending too. He paused, then added gruffly, You fought well, both of you. Whatever else is true, you've earned the right to speak your piece in Silver Creek. They fashioned a travoy from saplings and blankets, moving Elias as gently as possible. He drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid enough to argue about leaving him behind, sometimes lost in fevered memories of other battles, other wounds. Miriam rode beside him, one hand on his chest to feel each precious breath. Should have known, he muttered during one of his clearer moments. Your husband, not the type to let go. Save your strength, she told him, but he persisted. If I don't make it, you will. Miriam. His voice carried command despite his weakness. Listen, in my cabin, under the floorboards, letters. From Emma. Saved them. Want you to have them. You can give them to me yourself when we go back. He managed a ghost of a smile. Stubborn woman. You taught me well. The journey to Silver Creek was a nightmare of careful progress and constant fear. Every jostle of the travoy brought a groan from Elias. Every pause to check his breathing stretched like eternity. But Miriam discovered wells of strength she hadn't known existed, born from the simple refusal to let this man die for her freedom. They reached the town as the sun climbed toward noon, their strange procession drawing stares and whispers. Thompson sent Samuel ahead to find the doctor while the rest of them made for the courthouse, where Circuit Judge Harrison held session. He needs the doctor first, Miriam insisted. But Thompson shook his head. Judge only sits today. Miss this chance and your husband wins by default. He gestured to his men. We'll get Macready to Doc Brennan. You go speak your truth. It was the hardest thing she'd ever done, walking away from Elias's still form. But she knew Thompson was right. If she didn't face this now, it would all be for nothing. The flight, the fear, the blood spilled in her name. The courthouse was packed, word having spread of the morning's violence and the unusual party seeking justice. Judge Harrison, a stern man with silver whiskers and sharp eyes, called for order as Miriam entered. And there, seated in the front row like a righteous pillar of the community, was Josiah Whitmore. He dressed for the occasion in his finest black suit, Bible clutched in his hands, the perfect image of a concerned husband. His eyes found hers across the room, and she saw the fury there, carefully banked but burning hot beneath his composed exterior. "Your Honor." Josiah rose smoothly. "I thank you for this opportunity to reclaim my poor, deluded wife. As you can see, she's been through an ordeal, led astray by violent men who—" "You'll have your turn to speak, Reverend." Judge Harrison cut him off. "Mrs. Whitmore, approach the bench." Miriam walked forward on legs that wanted to shake, drawing strength from the memory of Elias's blood on her hands, from the courage of men who'd chosen conscience over easy obedience. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear despite everything. "I stand accused of abandoning my husband. I don't deny it, but I ask you to hear why." "Proceed." She told it all, every brutal detail, every small cruelty that had built into an unbearable weight. She spoke of forced confessions and midnight punishments, of a man who used God's word as a weapon and marriage as a prison. She showed the bruises still fading on her arms, described the night he'd demanded she'd lie before their congregation. "These are wild accusations," Josiah interrupted. "Your Honor, my wife suffers from hysteria. Delusions brought on by—" "I said you'd have your turn." The judge snapped. "Continue, Mrs. Whitmore." "This morning, men sent by my husband attacked our party. Good men were wounded. One may be dying as we speak, all because Josiah cannot bear to have his authority questioned." She turned to face her husband directly. "You told them to bring me back dead or alive. Why? Josiah, what threat does a living wife pose to a righteous man?" "Lies." Josiah's composure cracked slightly. "Your Honor, she's clearly been corrupted by that mountain savage she's taken up with. That savage is Elias McCready." A new voice spoke from the back of the room. Samuel Thompson stood in the doorway, blood still on his clothes from the morning's battle. "He served with distinction in the 14th Cavalry. Saved my life this morning when Reverend Whitmore's hired killers came for Mrs. Whitmore." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Harrison hammered for order. "Young man, that's a serious accusation." "It's the truth, Your Honor. We captured one of the attackers alive. He's outside with Marshal Davies, ready to testify that Reverend Whitmore paid them to ensure his wife never reached this courtroom." The judge's eyes narrowed as he looked at Josiah. "Reverend, perhaps you'd like to explain why hired guns were necessary to retrieve a hysterical woman?" For the first time in 5 years, Miriam watched her husband struggle for words. His carefully constructed facade was crumbling, revealing the desperate, controlling man beneath. "They're all lying," he said finally, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. "This is a conspiracy to destroy a man of God. Then you won't mind if we hear from this captured attacker," the judge said mildly. "Marshal, bring him in." What followed was devastating to Josiah's case. The wounded attacker, facing a noose for attempted murder, sang like a bird. He detailed how Josiah had recruited them, promised them gold to ensure Miriam never testified. How the Reverend had specifically said a dead wife would serve his purposes better than a rebellious one. "After all," the man quoted, "a martyred wife killed by Indians would make me a sympathetic widower. A wife who speaks against me makes me a fool." The courtroom sat in stunned silence. Even Josiah's supporters from Redemption Creek looked shaken, seeing their spiritual leader revealed as a would-be murderer. Judge Harrison's voice was granite when he finally spoke. "Reverend Whitmore, you stand accused of conspiracy to commit murder, assault, and abuse of your marital authority. This court finds sufficient evidence to bind you over for trial." He turned to Miriam. "Mrs. Whitmore, your petition for dissolution of marriage is granted on grounds of cruelty and attempted murder. You are free to go." Free. The word hit Miriam like a physical blow. After everything, it came down to that simple declaration. She was free, but her joy was tempered by fear. "Your Honor, Elias McCready, the man who protected me, he was gravely wounded in the attack. Please, I need to go to him. Go, the judge said, not unkindly. And Mrs. Whitmore, you showed great courage today. Not many would have stood up as you did. She ran from the courthouse, past Josiah now being led away in shackles, his protests falling on deaf ears. The streets of Silver Creek blurred as she searched for the doctor's office. Following the directions a helpful townswoman provided, she found Elias in a clean bed, his chest wrapped in white bandages, his breathing shallow but steady. Dr. Brennan, a competent-looking man with kind eyes, met her at the door. He's strong, the doctor said without preamble. Lost a lot of blood, and the lungs damaged. But if infection doesn't set in, I think he'll pull through. He's been asking for you when he's conscious. Miriam sank into the chair beside the bed, taking Elias's hand in both of hers. His eyes fluttered open at her touch, focusing with effort. Hey, he whispered. Hey yourself. She squeezed his hand gently. You missed all the excitement. I'm officially a free woman. Josiah's going to prison. Good. He studied her face. You all right? I am now. She leaned closer. You saved my life. Elias McCready, threw yourself between me and a bullet. That was foolish. Would do it again, he said simply. Miriam, rest now. I'm not going anywhere. She smoothed his hair back from his forehead. We have time, all the time in the world. As he drifted back to sleep, Miriam sat in the afternoon light, holding the hand of the man who taught her that independence wasn't sin, that desire could be holy, that sometimes salvation came not from submission, but from the courage to fight for your own soul. Outside, Silver Creek went about its business, unaware that in a small room above the doctor's office, two broken people were slowly learning how to be whole. The preacher's wife had run from sin only to discover that the greatest sin of all was allowing others to define what was sacred and what was profane. And in finding that truth, she'd found something else, a love born in extremity, tested by fire, and strong enough to build a future on. It wasn't the life she'd imagined when she'd fled into that storm, but it was hers, chosen freely and without shame. That, Miriam thought as she kept vigil beside Elias's bed, was its own kind of miracle. The small settlement of Haven's Rest sat nestled in a valley where two rivers met, far from the reach of Redemption Creek's poisoned whispers. It was here that Elias and Miriam had found refuge 3 months after the trial. In a community of other souls seeking second chances, former soldiers, freed slaves, immigrants, and outcasts who asked few questions and judged more by deeds than past sins. Their cabin stood on the hillside, modest but sturdy, with a view of the mountains that had brought them together. Elias, though still recovering from his wound, had insisted on building it himself with help from their neighbors. Miriam had watched him work, seeing in each carefully placed log a promise of permanence, of a life chosen rather than imposed. Now, as autumn painted the aspens gold, she stood at their door watching storm clouds gather on the horizon. The familiar tightness in her chest had been building all day, that old fear that happiness was temporary, that peace was just the pause before another catastrophe. You're doing it again, Elias said from behind her, his arms sliding around her waist. Doing what? Waiting for the sky to fall. He pressed a kiss to her temple. It's just a storm, Miriam, not a judgment. She leaned back against him, drawing comfort from his solid presence. His recovery had been slow but steady, the damaged lung leaving him short of breath sometimes, but not stealing his strength. If anything, their shared brush with death had only intensified what was between them. Love forged in crisis, but deepening in quiet moments like this. I know, she said. It's just, I heard news in town today, from a traveler passing through. Elias tensed slightly. What kind of news? Josiah's trial is next month. He's been in jail all this time, preaching to anyone who'll listen about being persecuted for righteousness. She turned in his arms to face him. They say he's gathering supporters, people who believe I'm a Jezebel who corrupted godly men with my wiles. Let them talk, Elias said firmly. They can't touch you here." But even as he spoke, they both heard the sound of horses approaching. Multiple horses, riding hard. Miriam's hand found Elias's, old fears rising like floodwater. 3 riders crested the hill, and Miriam's heart nearly stopped. But then she recognized the lead figure, Samuel Thompson, taller now and wearing a deputy's star. Relief washed through her as the young man dismounted, removing his hat respectfully. "Mrs. McCready," he said, using the name she'd taken though no official ceremony had blessed their union. "Mr. McCready, sorry to trouble you." "No trouble, Samuel," Elias said, though his hand stayed near the pistol on his hip. "What brings you to Haven's Rest?" Samuel's face was grave. "I'm afraid I've got difficult news. There's been developments with the Reverend's case." They invited him inside, Miriam's hands trembling slightly as she poured coffee. Samuel sat at their rough-hewn table, looking older than his years. "Josiah's escaped," he said without preamble. 2 nights ago. Had help from some new converts he'd made in jail. They overpowered a guard, near killed him. The cup slipped from Miriam's hands, shattering on the floor. Elias was already moving, checking the locks on windows, his soldier's instincts returning. "There's more," Samuel continued. "He left a message, said he's coming to reclaim what's his, to punish the adulteress and the man who led her astray. Marshal Davies has men looking, but..." He shrugged helplessly. "These mountains are vast, and Josiah's got believers helping him now, people who think he's a prophet being tested by God." "How many?" Elias asked, his voice steady despite the tension radiating from him. "Could be 6, could be a dozen. Reports vary." Samuel met Miriam's eyes. "I'm sorry, ma'am, I know you thought this was over." "It was never going to be over," Miriam said quietly, surprising herself with her calm. "Not really. Josiah doesn't know how to let go of what he thinks he owns." "You could run," Samuel suggested. "Go further west. California, maybe." "No," Miriam's voice carried steel. "I'm done running. This is our home. We built it. We've earned it. And I won't let him drive me from another life." Elias moved to her side, pride and worry warring in his expression. "Then we prepare for siege." Over the next days, Haven's Rest transformed. Word spread quickly through the settlement, and Miriam discovered what it meant to be part of a true community. Men who'd faced their own demons volunteered to stand watch. Women who'd fled other kinds of bondage helped fortify the cabin. Even the children contributed, gathering water and supplies. "You don't have to do this," Miriam told Martha Clearwater, a former slave who'd traveled the Underground Railroad to freedom. "This isn't your fight." Martha fixed her with a steady gaze. "Honey, any woman standing up to a man who thinks he owns her, that's always been my fight." They worked in shifts, preparing for a confrontation that might come in days or never. Elias coordinated defenses with the strategic mind that had made him valuable in the cavalry. But Miriam saw the toll it took. He'd come to these mountains to escape violence, and she'd brought it to his door. "Stop," he said one night, finding her crying silently by the window. "Stop blaming yourself." "How can I not? You had peace before I had emptiness," he corrected firmly. "I was a ghost haunting these mountains, not living but just existing. You brought me back to life. Miriam, whatever comes, that's worth any price." She kissed him then, pouring all her fear and love and gratitude into the connection. When they finally parted, she felt steadier, more certain. "I need to do something," she said. "I can't just wait for him to come. I need to face this on my terms, not his." Elias studied her face, reading the determination there. What did you have in mind? Her plan was simple in concept, dangerous in execution. Rather than wait for Josiah to attack their fortified position, she would draw him out. Choose the battlefield. The old mission church 5 miles north sat abandoned but intact, neutral ground where none of their neighbors would be at risk. "You want to bait him," Elias said flatly. "I want to end this, one way or another." She gripped his hands. "He's expecting me to cower. to hide behind you and walls. But that's his game, his rules. If I face him directly, publicly, take away his narrative of the fleeing adulteress, he could kill you. He could, but I don't think he will. Not immediately. Josiah needs an audience for his righteousness. He'll want to break me first, make me confess, validate his martyrdom. Her smile was sharp. But I'm not the woman who fled into that storm anymore. I've found my voice, and I intend to use it. It took 2 days to arrange. Samuel, acting as intermediary, spread word that Miriam would be at the mission church at sunset in 3 days' time, ready to face her accuser before any who wished to witness. The news traveled fast, reaching ears both friendly and hostile. It's madness, Samuel argued when he returned with confirmation that Josiah had received the message. You're giving him exactly what he wants. No, Miriam corrected. I'm giving him what he thinks he wants. There's a difference. The appointed day dawned clear and cold. Miriam dressed carefully in a simple blue dress, not the submissive gray Josiah had preferred, but nothing that could be called provocative. She braided her hair neatly, looked at herself in the mirror Elias had traded for last month. The woman looking back was different from the one who'd fled Redemption Creek. Stronger, clearer-eyed, marked by hardship but not broken by it. She wore her choices like armor, each decision a link in mail that no accusation could penetrate. Ready? Elias asked. He'd dressed in his old cavalry uniform, the one he'd kept buried in a trunk. The message was clear. This was a soldier defending what was his, not a mountain hermit caught up in scandal. Ready? She affirmed. They rode to the mission with an escort of neighbors, men and women who'd volunteered to witness whatever came. The old church sat bathed in sunset light, its adobe walls glowing like gold. And there, already waiting, stood Josiah. He'd lost weight in prison, his face gaunt and eyes burning with fanatic fervor. 6 men flanked him, hard-faced strangers who looked ready for violence. But there were others too, townspeople from various settlements, drawn by curiosity or loyalty, creating an audience for this final act. Miriam, Josiah's voice carried across the churchyard, still possessing that commanding timbre that had once made her feel small. My wayward wife returns at last. I'm not your wife, Miriam said clearly, dismounting with Elias's help. Judge Harrison dissolved our marriage. I'm here as Miriam Walker McCready, a free woman answering false accusations. Man's law, Josiah dismissed with a gesture. God's law is eternal. You are bound to me until death, and your adultery. My adultery? Miriam laughed, the sound startling in its genuineness. Josiah, I never broke our marriage vows. Not once in 5 years of your cruelty did I seek comfort elsewhere. It was only after I left, after you tried to have me murdered, after a lawful judge freed me, that I found love with a good man. Lies, Josiah hissed, but some in the crowd were murmuring. Which part? Miriam pressed forward, literally and figuratively. The bruises you left where clothes would hide them, the nights locked in the cellar, the confession you wrote for me to recite, full of sins I never committed. She addressed the crowd now, her voice carrying. He wanted me to stand before our congregation and lie, to say I was lustful and disobedient, to beg forgiveness for the crime of having thoughts of my own. You were rebellious. Josiah snapped. Willful. It was my duty as your husband to correct. To correct what? Laughter? Questions? The wish to breathe freely? Miriam felt the old anger rising, but now it was clean, righteous. You speak of God's law, Josiah, but what God demands such misery? What scripture justifies crushing another spirit for your own glory? Wives, submit to your husbands, Josiah quoted, his voice rising to sermon pitch. As unto the Lord. Husbands, love your wives, Miriam countered, even as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it. Where was your sacrifice? Josiah, where was your love? All I saw was pride and control dressed up in scripture. The crowd was fully engaged now, some nodding at Josiah's words, others frowning at the picture Miriam painted. This was what she'd counted on, that given a true choice between versions of truth, some would see clearly. She's bewitched you all, Josiah declared. sensing the shift. As she bewitched him, he pointed at Elias. This man, this killer who hides in the mountains, he poisoned her mind against righteousness. This man, Miriam said firmly, showed me what love without conditions looked like. He risked his life for mine, took a bullet meant for me, and never once asked me to be less than what I am. She looked directly at Josiah. Can you say the same? I tried to save your soul. You tried to own it. There's a difference. The sun was setting now, painting everything in shades of blood and gold. Josiah's supporters shifted restlessly, waiting for his signal. But the mixed crowd made open violence risky. Enough words, Josiah said finally. You will come with me now. Submit to proper correction, or face the consequences of your rebellion. No, Miriam said simply. Then you choose damnation. I choose freedom. I choose love. I choose the life I've built with my own hands and heart. She stepped closer to him, close enough to see the desperation beneath his righteous mask. I choose to forgive you, Josiah, for all you did to me, but forgiveness doesn't mean submission. I'll pray for your soul, but I'll never again let you touch mine. Something broke in Josiah's face then, the careful control finally shattering. He lunged forward, hands reaching for her throat, but Elias was already moving. The two men collided, grappling in the dust as the crowd scattered or pressed closer. But it was Miriam who ended it. As the men struggled, Josiah's jacket fell open, revealing a hidden pistol. Without thought, acting on pure instinct, Miriam grabbed it, stepped back, and held it steady. Enough, she commanded, and something in her voice froze everyone. No more violence, no more blood. It ends here. Josiah, on his knees in the dust with Elias's knife at his throat, looked up at her with eyes that finally showed fear. You wouldn't, you can't, it's not in your nature. You're right, Miriam said calmly. Killing isn't in my nature, but defending what I love is. She addressed his men. Take him. Leave this place. Tell whatever story you need to tell, but know this. I am not hiding. I am not running. I am living my life in the open. And if any of you think to change that, you'll find a woman who learned strength in the forge of your prophet's cruelty. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Then, slowly, two of Josiah's men stepped forward to help him to his feet. The fight had gone out of him. The grand confrontation he'd envisioned crumbling into dust and defeat. This isn't over, he said, but the words lacked conviction. Yes, it is, Miriam replied. You'll go back to prison. You'll serve your time. Maybe you'll find real redemption there, the kind that comes from looking honestly at your own sins instead of inventing them in others. I hope you do. But either way, I'm done being a character in your story. I have my own to write. They left him there, his supporters helping him onto a horse, the crowd dispersing with whispers and glances. Samuel Thompson stayed behind to ensure the peace, tipping his hat to Miriam with something like awe. Ma'am, that was, I've never seen anything like it. Courage, Samuel, she said softly. Your mother would have understood. Sometimes the bravest thing is simply refusing to play by rules designed to keep you small. As they rode home through the gathering darkness, Elias reached over to take her hand. You know there might be others. His believers, people who think. I know, Miriam interrupted. But I'm not afraid anymore. Whatever comes, we'll face it. Together. They crested the hill to see their cabin windows glowing with lamplight, neighbors still keeping watch, a community that had chosen to stand with them. It wasn't the life either of them had planned, but it was theirs, built on choices freely made and love freely given. No regrets? Elias asked as they dismounted. Miriam looked at him, this man who'd saved her in every way a person could be saved, who'd shown her that strength and gentleness could exist in the same heart, who'd taught her that true partnership meant standing beside, not behind. Not one, she said, and meant it. Inside their home, she unpinned her hair and let it fall free, breathing deeply of air that carried no fear, no judgment, no cage bars disguised as protection. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. News of the confrontation would spread. Opinions would form. Consequences would ripple outward. But tonight, she was simply Miriam. A woman who'd run from false sin and discovered true grace. Who'd fled one life and built another. Who'd learned that sometimes the most sacred thing of all was the courage to claim your own soul. The storm that had been building all day finally broke, rain drumming on the roof like applause. But inside was warmth and light, and the quiet presence of a love that had grown from desperate flight into something as solid and lasting as the mountains themselves. The preacher's wife had run from sin, until the rugged scout taught her that what she'd been running from wasn't sin at all. And what she'd been running toward was the oldest gospel of all, the freedom to be fully, truly, unapologetically alive. The courthouse in Redemption Creek stood silent as Judge Harrison prepared to deliver his verdict. 6 months had passed since the confrontation at the Mission Church, and Josiah Whitmore faced judgment not from God, but from the law he'd tried to circumvent. Miriam sat in the gallery beside Elias, their hands clasped, watching justice finally circle back to find its mark. The trial had been swift but thorough. Witnesses came forward, men who'd been hired to hunt Miriam, townspeople who'd seen bruises hastily hidden, women who'd kept silent for years but found courage in Miriam's example. Even Elder Thompson, Samuel's father, had testified about Josiah's order to bring her back, dead or alive. Now, as Judge Harrison spoke, his words rang through the courtroom like hammer blows on an anvil. Josiah Whitmore, you have been found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, assault, abuse of clerical authority, and escape from lawful custody. This court sentences you to 15 years hard labor in the territorial prison. Josiah's shoulders slumped, the fire finally extinguished in his eyes. As the marshals led him away, he looked once at Miriam. She met his gaze steadily, offering neither forgiveness nor hatred, simply the acknowledgement of what was. Outside, the spring sun shone bright on the dusty streets. The town that had once whispered about the runaway preacher's wife now tipped their hats respectfully to the woman who'd stood her ground. Some still disapproved, clinging to old ideas about a woman's place. But the tide had turned. It's over, Elias said quietly. This part is, Miriam agreed. But look. She gestured to a small group of women gathered near the general store, talking animatedly. That's Mrs. Henderson and the younger Matthews girl, and 3 others I don't recognize. They've started meeting every week. Samuel tells me, reading together, discussing ideas, supporting each other. The ripples spread. Elias observed, as they should. No woman should suffer in silence because she thinks it's her godly duty. They rode back to Haven's Rest as husband and wife in truth now. Judge Harrison had performed a simple ceremony after the trial, making legal what their hearts had long since sealed. The settlement welcomed them home with quiet celebration, understanding that victory over injustice was worth marking but not exploiting. Their cabin had been expanded over the winter months, with a proper bedroom added and a larger hearth that could warm the whole space. But the best addition stood by the window. A writing desk where Miriam had begun setting down her story, not for fame or revenge, but so other women might know they weren't alone. Another letter came while you were gone, Martha Clearwater said, handing Miriam an envelope. From Denver this time. Miriam had started receiving them months ago, letters from women who'd heard her story, who wrote of their own struggles, their own cages. Some asked for advice, others simply needed someone to know their truth. She answered every one, her neat handwriting carrying hope across miles of frontier. That evening, as golden light slanted through their windows, Miriam and Elias sat on their porch watching the sun set behind the mountains. The valley below bustled with life. New families arriving, crops being planted, a community growing strong. Do you ever miss it? Miriam asked suddenly. The solitude? The silence? Elias considered, his arm around her shoulders. Sometimes, he admitted. But then I remember what that silence cost. It was easier, maybe, but it wasn't living. Just like your life with Josiah might have been easier if you'd never questioned, never resisted, never run, she added softly. Never run. he agreed. Though I'm grateful you did. Grateful you stumbled into my part of the mountains, half frozen and fully fierce. She smiled, remembering that desperate night that now seemed a lifetime ago. I thought I was choosing death over dishonor. Instead, I found life. We both did. As darkness settled over the valley, lamps began to glow in windows below. Each light represented a story, a struggle, a choice to keep going despite hardship. Miriam thought of all the women still trapped in their own versions of her former life, and felt the weight of her freedom as both gift and responsibility. I want to build a school, she said suddenly. Not just for children, but for women too. A place where they can learn to read, to write, to think for themselves. The town council might resist, Elias warned, though his tone suggested support. Let them. I've faced worse than disapproving councilmen. She turned to look at him. Will you help me? Always, he said simply. Inside. They prepared for bed in comfortable domesticity. The life they'd built wasn't grand or easy. Money was often tight. The work was hard, and echoes of the past sometimes haunted their dreams. But it was theirs, chosen freely and lived fully. As Miriam brushed her hair, still long, still worn free when she was home, she caught sight of herself in the mirror. The woman looking back bore scars, visible and invisible, but she wore them without shame. They were proof of survival, marks of a battle won not through violence, but through the simple, radical act of claiming her own life. Elias, she said softly, turning to where he sat cleaning his rifle. Old habits died hard. Thank you. For what? For seeing me. Not the role I was forced to play. Not the broken thing I thought I was, but me. He set the rifle aside and crossed to her, taking her hands. You were never broken. Miriam. Bent, maybe, caged, certainly, but never broken. He kissed her gently. The woman who walked into that courtroom today, who faced her abuser without flinching, who's building a new life and helping others do the same, that's who you always were. You just needed space to unfold. Later, as they lay together in the darkness, Miriam thought about the journey that had brought them here, from a loveless marriage built on control to a partnership built on respect, from silence to voice, from sin defined by others to grace defined by truth. I used to pray for rescue, she whispered into the darkness, for God to change Josiah's heart or stop mine from beating. I never imagined the answer would be my own feet carrying me into a storm. Maybe that's how grace works, Elias replied, not as rescue from above, but as courage from within. The next morning brought new challenges and new possibilities. A letter from the territorial governor expressing interest in Miriam's school proposal. A visit from a young woman seeking shelter from her own brutal marriage. The normal rhythms of a life lived openly, without apology or pretense. As Miriam stood in her garden, hands deep in soil, planting seeds for the summer harvest, she thought of her mother's words long ago. Some plants grow best in shade, others need full sun. The trick is knowing which you are. She'd spent 5 years trying to grow in shadow, pruning herself to fit someone else's design. But here, in the full sun of freedom, she flourished. And if her growth inspired others to seek their own light, to run toward life instead of away from death, then every step of the journey had been worth taking. The mountains stood eternal around them, witnesses to all the small human dramas played out in their shadows. But Miriam no longer saw them as walls or obstacles. They were simply the backdrop to a life, finally, fully lived. A life that began the night a preacher's wife ran from sin and discovered that the only sin had been accepting someone else's definition of what was sacred. In the end, that was the greatest lesson the rugged scout had taught her, not through words, but through example, through patience, through love that expected nothing but her authentic self. And in learning it, she'd become teacher herself, showing other souls the path from captivity to freedom, from silence to song, from fear disguised as faith to the genuine article that could move mountains. The sun climbed higher, warming the earth. calling seeds to growth and souls to courage. And Miriam McCready, once Whitmore, born Walker, worked her garden and planned her school and loved her husband, free at last to be exactly who she'd always been meant to be. Thank you for listening to this story of courage, love, and freedom in the Wild West. I'd love to know where you're enjoying this tale. Are you listening during your commute, relaxing at home, or perhaps on a long journey of your own? Please subscribe to From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories and experiences matter, just as Miriam's did. Let's keep the conversation going about strength, choice, and the courage to claim our own lives.